Hello, my name is Nathan Swift. I'm a security cloud solution architect here at Microsoft. And today we'll be talking about security automation, part 3, talking about some of the actual actions that we're going to get involved with today. So let's go ahead and dive right into this. So what we have here is the security automation template that we filled out for the security automation that we're going to build for Azure Defender. So an Azure Defender alert comes in, and today we're going to be focusing mostly on this aspect, the action of looking up the Azure activity logs, looking backwards for 14 days on the Azure resource that was involved with the alert, and getting some more information about the audit logs of who was creating the Azure resource or modifying the Azure resource in the last 14 days, so that we can also email not only the security operations team, but also the folks that were involved with modifying or creating that resource. They may have some additional insight and knowledge that could aid and lend in the investigation of this security alert. So let's quickly take a look at this. And to get an idea of the next step that we need to take, we'll need to look at the Azure Resource Manager's REST APIs. And to get an idea of that, we can look at a REST API call called activity logs and listing the activity logs. This is a really great reference. You can find all of the Azure APIs available that you can invoke in a Logic app. And so looking in here, we've got under Azure Monitor the activity logs and a capability of listing those activity logs. Now, the reason why I'm using the activity logs REST API rather than looking at potentially log analytics workspace where we're piping out the activity logs is that's a dependency we're going to be building into the solution. So the customer would have to be exporting the activity logs or the Azure activity data table to a log analytics workspace. And then they would have to refer to it in the security automation. So I'm going right to the source, right? Because we do store the audit logs for Azure activity. Sally modified a network security group and opened up 443. Sam went ahead and set the storage account for public access on container XYZ. Those type of audit events are stored and are left for, I believe, 30 days, potentially 90 days out there. And so we can always call this API and get those activities. And the nice thing about this is if we look into the REST API itself, it has a filter capability that allows us to do timestamps. So we can do a start and stop time. So we can do time and say, hey, I want to look back 14 days from this date and time to the current date and time. But also what's interesting here is we can list the events themselves for a particular resource. So rather than looking at all of the audit logs in a subscription, or even all of the audit logs in a resource group, we could say, no, I want to look at the specific audit logs that were involved with the particular storage account in that security alert, or that VM in that security alert. So we can use resource URI in the filter string to go ahead and say, I need the audit logs from 14 days ago, for this specific Azure Resource ID, and we'll go ahead and get those logs back. Now, the nice thing about the Azure documentation is we get full-blown examples as well, too. So we can see here's a sample request where we're calling this at the subscription level, and we're looking for, in particular, a resource group and the security events around that. That won't help us out in our security automation, but it gives us an idea of kind of what we're looking for. Again, the nice thing about these sample requests is they get you kind of started here. The other thing I love about the Azure Docs page here with the Azure Resource Manager APIs is there's a nice little try it button right here. So at any point we can click try it here, and we can go ahead and pass in the filters that we would need. in here, and we could go ahead and run that. I'm just going to go ahead and put something in here just to show you this. Obviously, this is the incorrect filter parameter, right? We have some examples here on how to do this. But the nice thing about this is if we're testing back and forth in the Azure Docs page, we can get a nice sample code and the return body. So if I did put the proper filter in here, we get a 200 or 202, and then we get the filter or the audit events themselves in a JSON format back. So in order to do this with the security automation, I'm going to go ahead and quickly pull this up. And what we were just looking at in that REST API call was this concept of date and time, right? We got to look back 14 days. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and collect time current and past. So we're going to need to know that date and time current and past in order to make that REST API call here for the Azure activity logs against that resource ID. We'll also need the Azure resource ID itself. Now, last time when we were talking about triggers, we were just kind of playing a little bit with filtering on those. And one of those things that we saw was that we would need the Azure Resource ID. And so when I'm looking at the output of that trigger, I'm going to need to know two things. I'm going to need to know the subscription to fill this in. And I'm going to need to know the timestamps, the 14 days ago timestamp and the current timestamp. But I'm also going to need that Azure Resource URI. That Azure Resource URI, it comes in via an entity where an Azure ID exists in that entity. Now, there'll be other entities as well, particularly if they're of a type of file or type of host or type of account that was involved with that. These are all good, but they don't have the Azure ID that I need. So in the previous example in session 2, we talked about actually pulling out the individual Azure ID by filtering that array. And at the tail end of that, what I did was I deleted a couple of those actions that were involved with pulling out that Azure ID, and then I saved that logic app. No worries here. So this is one of the great things about logic apps where you're developing and programming these things and going through iterations of them. We always stored that logic app and the previous versions under a blade called versions here. And so under versions here, if I go and look back at the last day we were doing this and recording it, I can go back and there it is. There's that filter array that we were doing with that information. In particular, looking for that Azure ID and then filtering it and moving it into a variable. So what I can do is I can promote this code here. This is a great way as you're working with logic apps if you need to restore from a previous version. So they'll maintain a ton of those versions out there for you as you're editing and changing and saving and testing this logic app. So when I promote this, all I have to do now is go ahead and click save here. And now that logic app is updated. So now if I go into the logic app and I go into overview and I go into my edit page, I'm going to have the new promoted code again with the filter array this time. So really awesome tool. It's in a blade called versions that we can use. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start working with this logic app here and building that action out. And so I know I'm going to have to build out that logic app. I know I specifically need that Azure Resource ID. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll use that filter array. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and bounce back into this previous version here in the filter array. And while we're looking at the outputs of that, we can see here that the entity that comes back, it's still in an array format, but because we filtered on looking for Azure ID, and most of the security alerts are going to have a single Azure ID involved with them in Azure Defender alerts, what I can do is I can go ahead and say, you know what, that output from this filter array, let me go ahead and see here, and we can see here this is the filter array, and we could see this is a little trick here, right? You see how it moved into a for each loop? What it did was it auto-detected the body in an array format for us, and so we don't want that. So what we can do, though, is we can look at this filter array, and we can say that it's a body, and that it's going to be body, comma, or body, open parentheses, filter array, close parentheses. So in order to do this, I'm going to go ahead and discard my changes one last time. I'm going to go back into the edit mode here. And what I'm going to do is I am going to use an expression to call this out specifically. So I'm going to say body, and it was the name of this filter array. And you'll see an underscore here for any spaces that are involved with the logical name of the action step. And in this case, to prevent the for each loop being auto-built into the logic app like we saw last time, I'm going to specifically call for index 0 here. And after I call for index 0, I'm going to call for the Azure ID field here. So I'm going to go ahead and do a question mark, open up some brackets, and call the Azure ID field, and hit OK. And you'll see this time this didn't auto-incorporate an array with a for each loop because we're specifically calling the first entity 0, in that array. So I'm going to go ahead and save this guy here. And I'm going to go ahead and test this. If you recall from the last time, I can just resubmit the test here. And we'll go ahead and refresh this page here. And here is the latest update. And let's make sure we captured that Azure Resource URI. Perfect. So we can see now in this filter array, when we go to create that variable is now the Azure Resource URI based off that entity that was the Azure ID. So in the designer, I'm going to rename a couple things. I'm going to go ahead and initialize variable resource URI here. So rather than the variable being called resource name, it will be a resource URI. Go ahead and save this. Now, if we think back to the logic app, it also needs some timestamps involved with it. So we're going to need to get the timestamp of 14 days ago and the current timestamp. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new step here. And in choosing an operation, I'm going to look for date and time. And I'm going to switch over here to standard. And we'll switch to built-in. And here we go. So in built-in, if we look for date time, we can find not only the scheduled trigger, but current time. So I'm going to do this. You'll see all kinds of different capabilities. I'm just going to start with getting the current time. And then for the second date time that I would need, I'll need the past operation, or the past date time 14 days ago. So again, I'm going to go back to built-in, and I'm going to look through here and see if I can do a thing here called get past time. Returns this timestamp that is the current time minus the specified time interval. Well, this looks exactly something that I need. So I can now say, let's look back 14 days and to meet the automation requirement. And now with that, I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to go ahead and resubmit the alert to be ran again. We'll click the refresh page up here, get the latest run here, and now I've got the current time in a nice format and the date time 14 days ago. So today's November the 1st, and 14 days ago was October the 18th. And we get it in this nice crisp format with the year, dash, month, dash, date, time, hour, minute, second, and then the millisecond timestamp with Z. And if I'm looking back at the Azure activity logs, this is the exact timestamp that I need in this format. This is perfect. So I won't have to do any conversion of formats. You can do that in the Logic app. You could do that as an expression, or within the action for date time. There's also some get a date or a time, format it in this time zone, or format it this time in this type of format. Perfect. So now if I'm looking back at this API call that I need to make, I need to go ahead and call the API, get the pass in the subscription ID, and then pass in our example a little bit later, the resource URI in the filter. And so in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new step here. And I'm going to go ahead, and this is how we can make direct REST API calls to Azure. By the way, you can make these direct API calls not only to the Azure management plane, but to Azure Active Directory, Office 365, any of the other Microsoft products, including Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. If you need to update, for instance, a URL, to block that URL from any devices that are running Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And so the common way to do this is to use HTTP action. This allows us to make a call. In this case, we're going to make a GET call, and we're going to update this as well too. We're going to change the name so that if someone's looking at this and reading this, they'll be able to make some sense of it. Get audits. So we're going to get the audits involved. And now, before I put a URI in, I'm going to go ahead and just put in the base URI, which is going to be a get call at management.azure.com. And I need to authenticate this Logic app to Azure Manager in order for it to make that GET call. So I'm going to check this box under Add New Parameters, Authentication. And there are different types of ways that you can do authentication. We could obviously do Azure Active Directory's OAuth. There's client certificates that you can pass. If you're making a call maybe to a different API that's outside of Azure, but the API has basic username and password for basic authentication, you could do that. In our case, we're going to actually use managed identity. And we're going to get a message here for managed identity. We're going to use a system assigned managed identity here. It's going to tell us, please enable the managed identity for the Logic app. So I'm going to go ahead and just save this next step out here. And if I go back into the Logic app, if I click on the identity blade here, I can go ahead and grant this Logic app an identity in my Azure Active Directory. So I'm going to go ahead and click on here and save. It's going to prompt me and say, hey, you're going to register this Logic app called Notify AZ Defender Alert by Azure Activity in your Azure Active Directory tenant, which then will allow it to be granted permissions, roles assigned to it in any of the Microsoft services. So once I've saved this here, I get a Azure AD Object ID, and I now have the ability to assign it a role. So one of the roles here early on in the testing that I'm going to give it is I'm going to give it at the subscription level. And in this case, I'm going to be notified that my account here is a contributor, right? This account is not an owner, and so it cannot give these permissions to it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and pause briefly here, switch and assign this role, and then we'll come back and look at it here in just a moment. All right, I went ahead and with a different account that had owner permissions, assigned the managed system identity of that logic app, Notify AZ Defender Alert by Azure Activity, as a reader role on the subscription itself where we're generating the security alerts. So what I can do here is hit discard here, go ahead and refresh here, and here we are with the assigned reader role to that logic app. Now, you need to be careful with assigning managed identities, role-based access control in Azure. In this case, this is a logic app, so this is low code and no code. That means that any of the actions, once this logic app are triggered, will be able to execute and do things that they're supposed to do. But be careful, because if you grant overly permissive capabilities to a managed identity, specifically a resource that maybe it's a compute, like a virtual machine. If that virtual machine were to get compromised, let's say that managed identity of the virtual machine was a contributor or an owner of Azure, of a particular subscription, or even worse, a management group, that environment where that compute and VM was compromised would then have kind of keys to the kingdom, right? As that managed identity, it could be called and authorized to do all kinds of things if someone had gotten into that OS environment. In this case, this environment's a little bit low code, no code, so what you see listed there is what it can execute. But even so, if someone were able to modify the logic app to do other things, and if the logic app's system identity was had more permissions than just reading things, it could go and touch and do those things. So just be aware of managed identities, system assign, and trying to, again, using least privileged access when granting managed system identities. So with this capability now, the logic app can now read and go out and pull those audit logs. However, we need to go back to the get audits here, and we need to take a quick look at the full URI that needs to be called. If we go back to the Azure documentation here, we've got kind of an example of that request here. A get call to the subscription, and then in this case, we're not using a filter called ResourceID. We were just kind of goofing around with the filter. But you'll notice that in the URI request, that where there's a percent, question mark, more importantly, a %224, and then the filter, you'll notice that this URL that we're calling is what we call URL encoded, meaning that if we want to make these calls, we're going to have to make sure that any slashes in the URL or any spaces or any other certain characters or symbols are URL encoded. So we'll see this kind of play out here in just a moment. To get us going, what I've done is I've went ahead and I kind of grabbed some information. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into this URI here. I'm going to paste this in here. And so you can see here in the base URI that we need to call. We need to call the subscription ID. We need to call in the pass time, which is the body of the get the 14 days from current time. And we need to, for our time window, also get the current time, the body of that current time that on the execution of this logic app. Last but not least, we're going to also need the resource URI. So in order to grab that, I'm going to go ahead and just delete the resource URI here. You're going to notice that I've already kind of cheated a little bit in this copy paste. I've already used the URL encoding needed from a previous logic app I designed. So I'm going to go ahead and we made that variable resource URI. I'm going to pass that in those little quotes there. And now what I'm going to do is I need to get the subscription ID. And so in order to get the subscription ID, you'll recall that we're capturing the full resource URI. That full resource URI that we're capturing has the subscription ID in it. We just need to extract that out of the resource URI. And so we go back to George Wilburn's article, Working with Logic App Parameters. And this is where we can finally use that first skip split on the variable resource URI and grab the slashes and grab the second slash, which would be the subscription ID. So what that would look like a little bit here is the following. So if I go into the logic app and I go over the resource URI, I see that the expression is called variables, open parentheses, resource URI. So in order to get the subscription ID here, what I'm going to do is delete out the subscription ID. I'm going to switch into the expressions that allow us to do all these wonderful things. Go ahead and update this a little bit though. We need to get this second slash, which is the subscription ID. And then we also need to grab the variable resource URI. Because that variable resource URI is just a string variable, there's no JSON body where we're having to filter on a substring within that JSON body because it's not JSON, it's just a string. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to still do first skip split, but we're going to call variables. There we go. We see it IntelliSense kicking in, and we're going to use the variable resource URI here. We're going to go ahead and click OK. And now what I'm grabbing is the resource URI, and we are going to split on the slashes. We're going to skip and start at the beginning and go 1, 2, and grab the body of this subscription ID here. So now with this, I'm going to go ahead and save. And I'm going to go ahead and, fingers crossed, run this guy again, resubmit. We're going to refresh here. And we see here in the latest timestamp that we're getting the audits. We see that the URI passed in has the subscription ID. And we're filtering those timestamps of the past time 14 days ago on October 18th. And we're getting the timestamp for the current timestamp. And now we're looking at the resource URI. Here's the full resource URI string that goes to the Azure ID that was involved, that VM Skynet. And now our output is actually showing us, instead of showing raw outputs, there's so many events coming back from this, we're being told that we need to download that option. So we can click download here. Wow, this is a lot of information back. As you can imagine, there were probably a lot of maybe GET or put calls and stuff on that resource ID Skynet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a new page here. I'm going to go ahead and just do JSON lint, and I'm going to search for JSON lint. You'll find a bunch of JSON online validators that can do linting for you automatically. You can go ahead and just pop that body in here, and I'm going to validate the JSON. This is going to auto format it for me. And now what I can do is I can start looking at the different things. So I can see that, hey, on such and such date time here, we had a deallocation of the VM. If I look again, we can see other actions that occurred. So what I'm going to do is just look for action here. Control F. We're going to search for action. And then let's go ahead and scroll through here and see the other actions. And there were at least 4 of these guys here. So deallocation, virtual machine was deallocated here throughout there. So 6 times it was allocated or maybe deallocated here. Nothing too crazy, right? But maybe we capture someone turning it on or modifying something in the storage account that allowed public access to it. And we've captured that that caller, right? So really what we're interested in here is the caller, so that we can email those people when they did updates or creations on that Azure resource that was involved with the security alert. So I'm going to go ahead and just close this guy down here. And you'll notice here, if you need to use something like a URL encoder, in order to figure out the spaces or special characters that are involved with taking a REST API call and getting them into a URL encoded thing, you can use urlencoder.io to bring back those results so that your logic app is showing those URL encoded expressions with that. And so with this, our next step next time will be to filter those logs based on folks who created or updated the Azure ResourceID. As you can see in right now, I get some activities and events coming back that really are just basically allocations, right? That the VM was allocated or the VM was deallocated. It's not really helpful. Maybe it is. Maybe we do want to notify people that have turned on this VM on and off. So that could be helpful. But for other Azure Resource IDs, kind of get calls or other calls to it may not be helpful. So what we really want to grab is anytime someone's doing something with like a write action on the resource, whether it's a VM, a network security group, storage account, web app, you name it, that's involved with the security alert, we want to look for things that are writes. Maybe we'll add allocation and deallocation as well, because this could be useful. This could be indicative of a person that actually does work with this virtual machine. If you think about like an enterprise where we've got thousands or hundreds of Azure subscriptions with thousands of developers and cloud operators maybe using these different resources, starting and stopping VMs, we're not going to know instinctively who those people are for that particular VM unless we're doing some really good tagging in governance. And if we're not doing that tagging governance, this is a quick way that the security operations team can look at the audit events for that particular resource for 14 days ago, and then get back people that have been involved with that Azure resource. So that's what we'll work on next time. Before we go, one last thing that we want to do is you'll notice here on each of the actions, we can add a comment. So this is very good practice if you're working and developing with low code, no code. There's still kind of a developer mindset. We want to add as many notes as we can so that if someone uses this logic app in the future, they know what each action is doing and or are able to kind of parse what these actions are doing in the overall scheme of things. So in this case, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, we need to filter on the alert entities for an Azure ID. And then we want to add a comment. This is going to be the Azure Resource ID URI. And then we're going to add a comment here, 14-day look back for audit events. And you can see here as I'm starting to add these notes in here, they're added right here. When we make this a deployable template, these notes will be in the deployable templates. So once this is deployed by someone else, they'll be able to quickly kind of look at these things and get a good sense of what we're doing here. So we're going to add one more comment here. And we're going to say, use Azure activity list API and get 14 days of audit events. All right. So now with these comments, we're going to go ahead and save here. And yeah, this is a great way to start using kind of the Logic app kind of as a low-code, no-code environment so people can kind of see what's going on here. So hopefully this has been really helpful. In session 3 here today, what we've done is we have taken our first action. We've looked at a current timestamp. We've looked at a past timestamp of 14 days ago. And then we've made an API, a REST API call into the Azure management plane for the Azure activity logs using those different timestamps. And then also grabbing with an expression the Azure ResourceID and then getting a subscription ID from that so that we can pass those different values into the overall URL encoded REST URI that we're making to get those 14 days of Azure activity events. Hopefully this has been really helpful. This is definitely stuff that I've learned over time, just coding and working with Logic apps. Check out expressions in the Logic app, and check out that article that George Wilburn had written about Logic app parameters. That's going to save you a ton of time. You're going to be doing this a lot when you're developing your security automation. You're going to see that the JSON body, the raw body, is going to have certain values throughout that you're like, ooh, I need that information to pass in later. And you're going to find out quickly that, hey, I don't want it to for each loop everything. I need it at like the zero index of a particular entity that I've filtered using that filter array. And I need a particular value outside of that string of slashes, the Azure Resource ID. I need to get the, in this case, the subscription ID, but it could have been the resource group name or the actual name of the resource itself. So again, hopefully this has been really helpful. I'm looking forward to session 4, where we're going to dive even deeper, probably start working on formatting an HTML responded email back to the security operations team. But before that, we got to think about CC field in that, or the to field in that email. And we're going to have to, in session 4, take the Azure activity logs, look for the caller ID that made the activities and the events, and parse that down into its own string, its own callers that are unique callers that we can pass in the CC field or into the to field of the security alert. So again, looking forward to session 4, where we're going to dive even deeper in manipulating the data. And then hopefully in session 5 or session 6, we're going to go ahead and go through how to make this an ARM template deployment and how to send this and make a pull request to GitHub around that. Thank you and have a wonderful day.